For decades, quantum computing has lived in a strange middle ground between science fiction and Silicon Valley marketing, a technology that always seemed to be 10 years away no matter what year you asked. That changed in a very specific, very official way when America's most secretive military research agency stopped speculating and put a real date on the calendar. DARPA did not just fund another research grant buried in a government budget document. It launched a formal, structured program designed to determine, with rigorous verification, whether quantum computers will genuinely outperform classical computers on real, useful problems by the year 2033. This is not hype from a startup trying to raise its next funding round. This is the United States Department of Defense treating that timeline as something worth staking real institutional credibility on. The program is called the Quantum Benchmarking Initiative, or QBI, and it did not appear out of nowhere. It kicked off in July 2024 as an expansion of an earlier DARPA effort called Underexplored Systems for Utility-Scale Quantum Computing, and it sits alongside a related program simply called Quantum Benchmarking, which focused on establishing the actual yardsticks for measuring quantum impact in the first place. QBI's specific mission is deceptively simple to state and extraordinarily difficult to execute. It is designed to rigorously verify and validate whether any quantum computing approach, regardless of the underlying hardware technology, can achieve what DARPA calls utility-scale operation by 2033, meaning the computational value the machine delivers actually exceeds the cost of building and running it. That distinction matters enormously. This isn't about hitting an arbitrary qubit count or generating another headline-grabbing laboratory demonstration. It's about proving that quantum computers can do something genuinely useful, cheaper or faster than classical computers already do it, within a specific, publicly stated window of less than a decade. Here's what makes DARPA's approach different from the usual wave of quantum computing hype you've probably seen scroll past on social media. The agency explicitly stated that QBI is not a competition between companies. Instead, DARPA set out to scan the entire landscape of commercial quantum computing efforts and identify every company that might plausibly be on a real path toward building a genuinely useful, fault-tolerant quantum computer within this time frame. Fault-tolerant is the key technical phrase here, and it's worth pausing on what it actually means. Today's quantum computers are notoriously fragile, prone to errors from the smallest environmental disturbance. Heat, vibration, even stray electromagnetic interference can corrupt a calculation mid-run. A fault-tolerant quantum computer is one that can detect and correct those errors automatically, allowing it to run long, complex calculations reliably instead of collapsing into noise after a few operations. Building that kind of machine at meaningful scale has been one of the central unsolved problems in quantum computing for years, and DARPA is essentially betting the US government's credibility on finding out whether it's actually solvable on a specific timeline, not an indefinite one. The way DARPA structured this evaluation process tells you just how seriously the agency is treating it. QBI runs as a multi-stage utility-scale quantum computer backed by a plausible, technically credible path to near-term realization, not just a vague roadmap slide from an investor pitch deck. Nearly 20 quantum computing companies were selected for that initial stage in April 2025. Chosen after DARPA reviewed detailed written technical abstracts, alongside full-day oral presentations delivered in front of a panel of leading American quantum experts. That is not a rubber stamp process. That is closer to a doctoral thesis defense conducted at the scale of an entire industry. From there, the field narrowed considerably. In 2025, DARPA announced that 11 companies had advanced to Stage B, a much deeper phase of the evaluation. According to Joe Altepeter, the DARPA program manager overseeing QBI, Stage B involves thoroughly reviewing every aspect of each company's research and development plans, not just whether they can hit next year's milestone, but whether their approach can genuinely stand the test of trying to build a transformative technology on this specific, aggressive timeline. The companies that made it to this stage read like a who's who of the serious quantum computing industry. Atom Computing, Dirac, IBM, IonQ, Nord Quantique, Photonic Inc., Quantinuum, Quantum Motion, Quera Computing, Silicon Quantum Computing, and Xanadu. Notably absent from that list were companies like Alice and Bob, HPE, and Rigetti, though DARPA was careful to clarify that missing Stage B doesn't necessarily mean a company is permanently out of consideration going forward. What happens after Stage B is where things get genuinely intense. Companies that survive both Stage A and Stage B move into the program's final phase, Stage C, where DARPA deploys what it describes as a full-size independent verification and validation team, essentially an outside group of experts whose entire job is to conduct real-time, rigorous evaluation of every component, every subsystem, and every algorithm that goes into actually building a fault-tolerant quantum computer for real. Alderpeter has been explicit that DARPA intends to conduct all of these evaluations without slowing the participating companies down, treating this less like a bureaucratic government audit and more like an embedded technical partnership designed to stress test each company's claims against reality as fast as the underlying engineering allows. One of the clearest examples of how seriously individual companies are treating this evaluation comes from Quantinuum, one of the 11 companies that advanced to Stage B. During its earlier 6-month Stage A effort, Quantinuum developed and delivered a detailed concept design for a utility scale system it calls Lumos. This wasn't an entirely new invention built specifically to please DARPA evaluators either. Quantinuum had already published a public roadmap outlining plans for a universal, fully fault-tolerant quantum computer called Apollo, scheduled for launch in 2029, and Lumos represents an extension of that same roadmap, pushing further into the next decade. According to Rajiv Hazra, president and CEO of Quantinuum, the company's Stage B selection specifically recognizes the strength and maturity of that roadmap, and the technical work the company's teams had already delivered well before DARPA's evaluation process began. In Hazra's words, Lumos gives DARPA what he called a concrete, de-risked path for achieving utility-scale quantum computing by 2033, language that mirrors DARPA's own stated program objective almost exactly. It's worth understanding just how unusual this kind of coordinated government-led benchmarking effort actually is within the broader technology industry. A significant challenge DARPA itself has acknowledged in evaluating these different companies is the sheer diversity of technological approaches on the table. Unlike classical computing, which converged decades ago around a single dominant architecture built on silicon transistors, quantum computing has no equivalent consensus. Companies in this program are pursuing wildly different physical approaches, including superconducting circuits, trapped ions, neutral atoms, photonic systems, and silicon-based quantum processors, each with fundamentally different engineering trade-offs, scaling challenges, and error correction strategies. DARPA's evaluators essentially have to become fluent in evaluating apples, oranges, and a half dozen other unrelated fruit, all while trying to determine which of these fundamentally different technical paths, if any, can actually deliver a genuinely useful machine before the 2033 deadline. This brings us to the deeper strategic question sitting underneath the entire program. Why would America's primary defense research agency invest this much structured effort into rigorously testing an industry-wide claim, rather than simply funding whichever company seemed most promising and waiting to see what happens? The answer lies in what's actually at stake if quantum computing does cross that fault-tolerant, utility-scale threshold on this kind of timeline. A sufficiently powerful error. Corrected quantum computer would not just accelerate drug discovery or materials science research, valuable as those applications are. It would also be capable of breaking many of the cryptographic systems that currently secure global communications, financial transactions, and classified government data. That dual nature, extraordinary scientific promise paired with genuine national security. Risk is exactly why DARPA cannot afford to simply guess whether 2033 is realistic. It needs a rigorous, independently verified answer because the consequences of being wrong in either direction, dismissing a threat that materializes on schedule, or overreacting to a threat that never actually arrives, both carry serious costs for national security planning across multiple agencies and industries that depend on stable, forward-looking encryption timelines. It's also worth recognizing what QBI represents for the quantum computing industry as a whole, beyond just the 11 companies currently competing to survive Stage B. This program effectively functions as the most rigorous, most technically demanding stress test the entire commercial quantum computing sector has ever faced from an external evaluator. Companies can publish as many optimistic roadmap slides and press releases as they want, but surviving DARPA's independent verification and validation process in Stage C requires actual demonstrable engineering progress that holds up under expert scrutiny, not just an ambitious slide deck. For an industry that has occasionally struggled with a credibility gap between big public claims and quieter private setbacks, having a rigorous, government-backed benchmarking process running in parallel gives outside observers, including investors, policymakers, and other governments, a genuinely trustworthy signal about which approaches are actually on track and which ones are further behind than their marketing suggests. There is also a competitive dimension to this story that stretches well beyond America's own borders. Every major technology power on Earth right now, from China to the European Union to Japan, is running its own version of a national quantum strategy, pouring billions of dollars into research programs aimed at reaching exactly the kind of breakthrough DARPA is trying to independently verify here. A rigorous, credible American benchmarking program does more than just inform domestic policy decisions. It gives the United States a clearer evidence-based picture of where it actually stands relative to those international efforts, rather than relying on competitor press releases or classified intelligence assessments that may themselves be incomplete or exaggerated. If Stage C ultimately concludes that certain American companies are genuinely on track to hit utility, scale quantum computing before international rivals, that becomes a powerful data point for national technology strategy. If the evaluation instead reveals that no American approach is realistically on pace to meet the 2033 target, that is equally valuable information, potentially reshaping how aggressively the government funds and prioritizes quantum research going forward. There's also a financial dimension worth understanding, because DARPA's evaluation process directly affects how private capital flows into this entire sector. Quantum computing companies have raised enormous sums of money from private investors over the past several years, often based on ambitious roadmaps that are difficult for outside investors to independently verify. A company's survival through QBI's Stage B and eventual entry into Stage C effectively functions as a credibility stamp that private markets pay close attention to, since it means an independent, technically sophisticated government evaluator has already scrutinized the company's claims far more rigorously than most venture capital due diligence processes typically allow. Companies that get eliminated from the program, on the other hand, may face harder questions from investors about whether their technical roadmap can actually survive serious scrutiny, even if they continue operating and raising funds outside of DARPA's evaluation entirely. So has the United States officially declared that quantum computing will beat classical computing by 2033? Not quite, and the distinction actually matters more than it might first appear. What DARPA has done is something arguably more significant than a simple prediction. It has built an entire, structured, multi-year, multi-stage verification apparatus specifically to determine whether that outcome is achievable, backed by real technical rigor rather than marketing optimism, and staffed with independent evaluators whose job is to find the cracks in every company's claims rather than simply take them at face value. If the answer that emerges from Stage C ends up being yes, multiple credible paths exist, that would represent one of the most significant technology validations in a generation. If the honest answer turns out to be no, or not quite yet, that will be just as valuable for national planning purposes, giving policymakers realistic timelines instead of comforting guesses. Either way, the fact that this evaluation is happening at all, with real government resources and real technical scrutiny, and a specific date attached to it, tells you the quantum computing conversation has moved well beyond speculative hype and into something the US government now treats as a serious, near-term strategic variable. Whatever the final verdict turns out to be when Stage C wraps up, the world will have a far clearer, evidence-backed answer than anything a company's own press release could ever provide on its own. If you found this breakdown useful, do not forget to like and subscribe, because we are going to keep tracking exactly which companies survive each stage of this evaluation and what DARPA's findings ultimately reveal about the real timeline for quantum computing. Because somewhere between now and 2033, the answer to one of the biggest technological questions of our generation is being tested quietly, rigorously, and with the full weight of American national security research behind it.